Everybody. Put my little bag down. So I get the unique ability to just sit back and bask in the supreme intelligence and perspective of the panelist. So, and sit into a very comfy couch. So let me just ask, I don't want to do like, just let me ask the panelists to please come up. This is not like, coming out like, oh, the last Republican debate and Ben Carson is stuck off on the side, which he probably should be stuck off on the side, but that's a different discussion for another day. Hi. Good morning. Hi. Yeah, sure. Come on. Okay. So I'm going to just do a very quick bio on each of them, but I could go on for a long period of time on that, and that would just cut into the ability to have a conversation, which is really what the point of this panel is. So what I think is most important, however, though, is they represent not only themselves and their combined expertise and intelligence, certainly, and experience, but also perspectives of different constituencies within the industry, which is really what's relevant for the panel. So Rod here is, I think you may have met earlier. She's the president of Insights, Research, and Data at iHeartMedia. iHeart, for those of you who don't know, encompasses both radio, online, mobile, digital, social, live, syndication, and independent media representation. She's previously had great experience at Yahoo MTV. She's got numerous awards, and I'm looking forward to what she has to say. Shenan is...
You guys met me already.
We met. She's the president of digital at MEC, and working with obviously with all things digital and data, has a strong background in integrated planning, and we'll talk today about her company's perspective. Tina, who is EVP of Director of Data Solutions at Bbdo, New York, and the quote is, she helps the work become even better by taking full advantage of data and all of the resources that the other partners within the Omnicom family have to work. She previously worked at RAP for a number of years. Sean is VP of America's Platform Solutions and Innovations at Google, working with Google display advertisers, and has worked a lot in that space. Prior to that, he was at DoubleClick. And Brian is I love this, he's a lead research scientist, brings facts to facts. He's from Facebook, working within the Marketing and Sciences group, where he focuses on methods and systems for improving cross-channel media effectiveness. So, let me just, and the goal here, by the way, is to try to have a conversation. I have questions that will cross, in a sense, the platform of all of the panelists, and also deeper questions with respect to each of the individuals. But this is not necessarily meant to be a stand-up session. It's meant to be a conversation. So let me just take a big step back, because all of you have expertise in all things data. But I want to really ask the panelists to really speak to the question of what is data? How do you define it? And this is the way I would ask you to think about it. From the perspective of the consumer, from the perspective of your clients, from the perspective of your company, and from your own individual perspective. Pretty easy question, right?
No.
So why don't we just go maybe my left across, so make it an easy one for you.
All right, so put simply, I consider data a raw ingredient. It's which, as a raw ingredient, it's almost a commodity having very little intrinsic value. Where it becomes valuable is when you're able to synthesize it. You can think of turning sand into glass, and in that analogy, turning data, we take data and we turn it into insights. And so it's just, a big flood of raw ingredients, raw materials from which we're able to hopefully synthesize something interesting.
Okay.
Along the same lines, and I think by the end will all sound repetitive, right? Data is information, but it's only meaningful if it generates insight. There's a ton of data. There's no lack of data. As Michael Roth said, 80% of the data out there is bad. As David said, if you can't actually look at it in the perspective of the consumer journey, it's meaningless. So again, data is information, only valuable with some special sauce to make it meaningful and help you with your business problems.
I agree. I think we look at data to tell meaningful stories at the end of the day, but data is only useful to us in that storytelling for our clients if we have people who not only can analyze and interpret, but really action. We talk about data now and how that data is fueling creativity right now.
So I think from the consumer's perspective for a second, I think consumers don't necessarily know what data is. I think they're scared of their data being out there. I think they're scared of their personal data getting identified. I think data seems almost like a dirty word to the consumer in some ways because they don't completely understand what it is and how it's used. And when it's used properly, like everyone said, it can be used to tell tremendous stories and gain incredible insights. What excites me about data is actually the opportunity to not tell what's been done, but potentially tell what's going to happen in the future. And that's where I think data gets really exciting. As data gets to be more real time over the course of where we are today and continuing into the future, we're going to have more predictive capabilities, and that's where it gets truly exciting.
Data is a cell phone bill to a consumer, right?
It is.
How much they can download.
Exactly.
We're all very boring because we have very similar opinions. I always look at data as its information and its knowledge that really helps us see something that we haven't seen before if we know how to do it and know where to look. And good data really helps us see something new, it helps us see something different, and it really helps us see something better than what we could previously do. I think it is often overused, as these panelists have outlined, and it really requires a company to know what they want to use data for and how they want to use that data. And probably the last aspect, coming from Google, we have data means a lot of different things to us. So data is not always about consumer information. Data can be about machine learning. Data can be about the right information that can lead to advancements in human technology and things. So there's just so many uses. Really, the first thing any company should be doing is understanding what they wish to get out of data and then how they make sure they collect it well and organize around it as a company.
So the discussion of the panel's topic is how data helps drive insights, creativity, and strategy and action. This obviously is a forum organized by the 4A's, and there are many agencies here represented. And so taking those two thoughts, which is how data can help in those areas, and then speaking really to the audience in terms of the agencies, whether it's, let's say, a media agency or an advertising agency, what recommendations based upon your perspectives could you tell them and say, this is how you can really help use data to drive insights, creativity, strategy, and action as an agency, either media or creative? Tina, want to start?
Sure. So my role is unique at Bbdo. It's new. I'm only 90 days in. But I think if you think about from an agency perspective, you need an analytical connector and translator. You need someone who's able to take all this sort of jargon, because I find it a lot of times, I think you were making a good point about data, is people misinterpret what they need from data. So there becomes a lot of crossroads. I also think it's a unique time right now where media and agencies are getting very tight together. And a lot of my role is bringing sort of what media is looking at for their analytics and results and what the agency are together. So I would say it's the day of that talent and people strategy and connectivity at the agency, where you can translate those solutions to make them actionable for the client. And right now at our agency, we're all about smart data and infusing that throughout the process. And hopefully working, whether it be Facebook or Google or whatever platform we're on right now, understanding not only those channels, but the other media outside that's influencing it.
Radha, you want to go?
So if I could just comment on that, right? And I think this isn't just true of the agency, it's true of the entire ecosystem. There tends to be this urgency that's bordering on panic around data, right? Like everyone feels they need data. They don't quite know what that means. They don't know why they're going to use it, but they need it, right? And they need their own. And I think we can all step back, and you don't have to own all your data. You can rent it, you can borrow it, you can steal it, you can... No, not
Don't
quite
steal
steal,
it.
that's the joke part.
Hey, word. Careful.
Hashtag joke. But also, where is it through strategic partnerships? Where is it through investments? Where is it honestly on a deal-by-deal basis, right? And I think this need to own everything, this need to have your own special secret sauce and bucket of data doesn't work in the long run, because what's interesting data today isn't interesting data tomorrow. That's what Michael was so articulate in explaining just an hour ago, which is, again, we media companies as well as agencies have to do the best by our clients, so that means being agnostic to a certain extent, right? And keeping your mind open and constantly changing as data flows change and the consumer journey changes. So to me, it's about focusing on the business problems, taking a step back and taking this sort of rent, own, borrow metaphor quite seriously.
It's actually a really interesting point. Data. I think we sometimes forget it has an expiration date. In our industry especially, it has an expiration date. I mean, the data sequence that is your DNA doesn't have an expiration date, but the data sequence that is the media dollars that we're spending and the click-through rates and all of that information that we're constantly gathering about consumers has an expiration date. And we get caught up in this desire to contain and hold, and we have to have as much of it as possible, and we need to not let anybody else touch it. And there's all of these discussions, and I'll pick on my friend over here. There's all of these discussions around walled gardens and who owns this data and where it's coming from and how we get it in and how we get it out and how we action it in other places. And I think just as a prediction for our industry, maybe it's more of a hope and less of a prediction, we have to find ways around that. Rather rapidly. We have to find ways around having better and faster and easier flows of information. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to be passing PII information back and forth. We all know that's a bad idea. We need to keep the consumer individual data out of this ecosystem. But if we can't get to actioning it in real time, it becomes less and less valuable. And the older it gets, it continues to get less and less valuable.
Yeah. I was picked on. Isn't this how you're supposed to say in a debate?
Yes.
I often...
It doesn't mean I don't love you. I respect you.
Thank you, Shenan. I'll cover off on those things as well, but I was going to go back to the point you were making. I think the urgency around data is kind of alarming to me, because it's always focused on one particular usage of data. And there's a lot of different types of data that can help advertisers and agencies become better. True. And all the rage right now is I need to have audience data, and I need to own as much of it as I can, and I need to use it on all of my advertising campaigns and almost hyper-target or over-target the consumer base I'm trying to chase. And that's a great usage of data. I run programmatic technology, so I think that's a phenomenal usage of data. But I don't think that's the only usage of data that media agencies and customers really need to be concerned about. There's a much broader strategy at play that they have to think about. And you can get just as much out of the insights from data that help you plan as you can from the execution that help you get a little bit more precise on how you're going to target that data. And I find some agencies do this really well, and some agencies and advertisers don't think about that all the time. And you can learn phenomenal things. If you guys saw some of the Super Bowl statistics, 85% of the Google searches on Sunday were mobile. Right? That's an interesting insight, because you can start to plan campaigns differently the next time. As an example, during the World Cup, that was also a phenomenon. I think 77% of the Google searches were mobile. And Nike took advantage of that, and they realized that during those events, people are going to use mobile phones, so let me have better mobile advertising, let me have more engaged mobile advertising that brought in social aspects, because people were crazed about WhatsApp at the time in Brazil. They built a really customized campaign around just the knowledge of how consumers would act, where they'd be interacting, and what was the best way to get them to engage. That was a phenomenal insight that came from search trend data, that came from social trend data, and they use that appropriately. And that's a really strong example of how a media agency can think differently for the customers. Right? And that I think there should be more discussion about how to pull out those insights and that intelligence. And there's lots of companies that are more than happy to share information like that. Like, we love working with customers on that basis. Like, what can we tell you about your customer that you didn't know that's available? Right? And that's I think, untapped that we should spend more time thinking about. On the ownership piece, it's a really tricky conversation, because a consumer says they own the data, a publisher says they own the data, an advertiser says they own the data, and an agency sometimes owns some of the data because they've invested in those things. So the trick is, how do you thread the needle to make sure that everyone gets access to what's required to make good decisions? And you do it in a way that protects all those constituents. So how can you protect a consumer that they have choice, that they have the ability to opt out, that we're not passing too much information? And that's something that we as a company care deeply about. It's a big tenet of Google's. And then also for the advertiser, are they really getting all the information that they deserve back in campaign cycles? Right? Because there's a lot of money that goes into how do I have a better campaign, how do I advance the customer journey well, and if you can't get return cycle on that, it hurts the future planning and optimization of those campaigns. And that's where companies like ourselves and Facebook, we have to really be careful and thoughtful about how we work with the agencies about to return the information that should go back to them. And that's a little bit of a work in progress sometimes. Sometimes we do it amazingly, and sometimes we do it terribly, because we're still building the systems and protections to do it well. But it's a conversation that has to keep evolving.
Brian?
Yeah, I'd like to address at least the walled garden. That gets obviously thrown around a lot, and the point you make is ultimately it comes down to protecting the consumer, right? Because Facebook, Google, these are platforms for the consumer first. And because they're good platforms, we're able to monetize it with the advertising. And keeping somewhat of a strict policy on the data really is in the best interest of the end user, right? Because they want to make sure, they generally know that their data is being used within the platform. But when they find out, or if they found out that their data is being exchanged in this ecosystem, kind of the underbelly of internet advertising, things get a little hairy and they lose trust in it. So it's, I think, again, another tenet for Facebook is to keep the consumer's privacy first and keep that contract, that covenant, sacred with the consumer. And so, we hear walled garden almost as a pejorative, but really we're trying to protect people.
So just a quick editorial aside, the other constituency, and it's not for the point of this conversation, is the legal regulatory aspect. So who owns data, who collects it, how it's used, how it's analyzed, and all of the other issues that relate. They are an important constituency, not that it's not being ignored by this group at all, but that's another element to that, because the need to not only control and use is something where they have a perspective in terms of slow down, because they look at the industry saying it's almost like a land grab. You're going to grab a lot of information very quickly, and the question is, take what you need, and the question is, what do you need? And the answer is everything, and that leads to ultimately to a conflict. Just different discussion.
But I think on that topic,
Sure.
like their role is to be the advocate for the consumer, because
Sure.
the consumer is not always in that conversations, and that's what those DPAs and governments, that's their job.
Mm-hmm.
How can I protect the greater good? But it always comes back to a basic boiling point is if you're taking data that a consumer is providing, are you giving them optionality? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's really the core issue within anything from a consumer. Do they know about it? Like, so most of the the FTC's arguments are around, do you have a good disclosure? Do you have full disclosure, right? And are you really telling everything? That's a really important tenet, because customers need to be able to make an informed decision on whether or not they're going to opt into data sharing. And data sharing, it's a login. Right? You're agreeing to share information with companies when you log into their property. And then also, how are their future options around? Can they control how they're getting messages, or they can opt out if they don't like what they're seeing? Those are all things that they're there to legislate and help the ecosystem think through. And I think those are all fine things, because ultimately, if you're a consumer, you feel you have no control, you're going to boycott, and you'll probably install an ad blocker, and then everyone loses.
Sure. And again, not meaning to talk about a bunch of lawyers. That would be the last thing this group wants to talk about today, including me. So let's go back to something that I'm interested in as well, which is and anyone can jump in and kind of give some examples. Do you find that the focus in terms of, and I'll use the word again, data, is helpful, inconsistent with, supportive, fill in the blank, in terms of creative, storytelling, effective advertising? Effective, not try to move away from a data metric, but effective in terms of what else that should really apply, which is the emotionality, something that touches you. So, anyone want to jump in?
So I'll start, right, sitting from the media company perspective. And I think the truth of the matter is a little bit of both. Data is incredibly powerful. I'm in the music business, so it's really, really powerful knowing, there's something really there. in this, we hear it in this artist. And we can also see it in these early stages of data. And you can, help make them even greater than they are. And you can, put programs around them. And you can also test, okay, this song of the summer is starting to fade now. And so, if you think of creativity from that point of view, I think there's something really powerful. But then we've also gotten to this world of hyper-targeting, uneven creative all over, not just the internet sphere, but every sphere of advertising. And I don't think we're harnessing data well to separate good creative and bad creative. There's just too much of it, too much data, too much creative, not enough analysis. And so I think that, data, like anything else, is a tool, right? And I think there are times when we use it really, really well, and at other times we just overuse it and forget why we were all there in the first place.
It's interesting to hear you say that there's too much creative, because on the other side of it, my complaint is often there isn't enough creative.
Or good creative.
Or enough good creative. No, from a client's perspective, like we look at the opportunity to have so many different stories to tell to different customers, right? If we can segment all of that data correctly, then I can tell a specific story to you that says this is the insight that I know about you, and so therefore this is the message that I'm going to give you, whereas this message might be more important to this person over here. And I want those multiple messages to share with people. And the challenge with creative is that it's expensive to produce. And so we start to look to automation solutions. Well, those automation solutions are interesting, but they're not very good. They're not beautiful. The executions aren't engaging, and we often see that they don't perform as well as we'd like them to, or as well as we were hoping they would. At the end of the day. But I do fear, and you both have now said the word hyper-targeting, which I think is really interesting. As a consumer, I actually fear how much we use data to target consumers, and that we're getting to a place where we will completely lose serendipity. There will not be that moment where a consumer says, I never thought I would even consider that, but now that you've shown it to me, I will. And do we lose something of a baseline consumer that maybe never would have been exposed to it? And it's the challenge of the sheer volume of media that we're putting in front of consumers today, and the sheer volume of advertising and exposure. Whereas we go back to the 50s when you could put one message out there and hit every television channel and every newspaper pretty simply, and you could tell them, here's my new soap. And everybody said, great, it's a new soap. And then everybody wanted that new soap. It was pretty simple. Now to try and create that same kind of phenomenon, you would actually need more money than I think the entire industry puts out on an annual basis.
And I think it needs to be pointed out that if you're going to do the hyper-targeting, really all that is doing is capturing demand.
Right.
People who've already showed it.
Right.
Now, what creates demand, right?
Right.
How do you inspire people? And I consider, despite it necessarily being counter to my job, a purely data-driven world to be a boring world, right? Notice Super Bowl ads don't give you product facts. They give you stories and laughter and inspiration. And so to me, that's the creative side that is actually doing the work of the advertising. The data kind of sits behind the scenes, makes sure it's optimal, lets you know that creative A is better than creative B. But it doesn't tell the story.
I totally agree. I mean, it's a beautiful time right now to be creative. And I think great work will rise to the top in this world of data-driven. But I think right now we see at Bbdo there's a couple of intersections that's happening. The first is data's helping us inform the why, the who, and the where. Where are these customers going to be? What are they going to play on? How are we going to hit that right target? There's a lot of choices right now. And we take that up into effect from the beginning, middle, and end. And the other is we're no longer launching campaigns or in market and then walking away. We're optimizing now in real time, and we have to have that sort of, I'm a Scrum Master, so that agility to come back and edit. Maybe we could just show some of the work from Bbdo. We're just going to show a quick clip. And there's just two spots in here. One is where Snickers, and hope you all saw it on the Super Bowl, but we did a campaign on Twitch because that's where our target audience was, and we invited them to sort of participate in that. The second is a campaign we launched for Lowe's, and as through the NCAA, and as people's brackets were blowing up and things were happening in culture, we were understanding differently of how we went back and we did an edit to the TV spot. So that's my little intro. We'll run the creative just so you can see a little bit of the work that's been informed by data.
Twitch pulls in 43% of all live video streaming, making it the perfect place for Snickers to find their target audience. Meet Trump SC. You may not have heard of him, but he's a really famous gamer. We got him to help us prank tens of thousands of gamers.
What's that?
You're not you when you're hungry. So during a live stream, Trump SC got hungry and started making mistakes.
Oh, wait.
The hungrier he got, the less he behaved like himself.
Oh, crap, I attacked again.
And the stranger he looked. The Twitch community knew something was up. And then boom! Trump SC became a spacey hippie guy.
What do you mean I'm not Trump? I'm Trump.
The live stunt played out for a while, then he ate a Snickers and went back to normal.
I'm all charged up, ready to go now.
Meanwhile, other popular gamers pulled off the same live stunt across Twitch simultaneously, and the gaming community went nuts. Within minutes, the live stunt hit the front page of Reddit. Fan recaps even popped up on YouTube, and someone made a straw poll to bring back the spacey hippie guy. The live stunt was experienced by over 130,000 fans in real time, and skeptical gamers everywhere approved.
So right after we launched the spot, to your point about data coming from anywhere, we understood there was a new insight that happened.
Just to follow up on that, because I think it was, again, the goal here was to have a conversation, but we certainly allowed this to occur because it was relevant to the conversation that we're having. But just to speak specifically, Tina, in terms of your role, it's a new role within Bbdo, and just kind of just talk about that, because the issue really is, in a sense, to what extent there still is in the agency and also in the marketer world and the media world, church and state, data and non.
Yeah.
And you're obviously at a very well-regarded creative agency. Can you speak to that discussion a little bit?
Sure, I think there's a few things. I think right now, like I said before, we need connectors. Media agencies are running a lot of information. They're owning a lot of analytics. We have to get together and put the customer and client at the center. I think the other thing is it's very confusing what's happening on platforms and what we can and can't ask for. So I really, it's a new role that we put in place, and I can honestly say I'm one of the most popular people at Bbdo right now because we're connecting and translating, and we're allowing those groups to get together. Andrew Robertson talks about connected brilliance, and we heard it a lot today. You shouldn't think you could do everything yourself, and you can't. You have to bring in all the right partners to get there. So I think right now it's that, it's education, it's teaching everyone the difference between attribution and ROI and what you can and can't do. And I think at the end of the day, we're doing a lot of training and infusing both to our clients and to our creative teams right now, and it's working really well.
Yeah. I think we're really at the beginning of doing it well. Like I love the usage of it, and I think in many ways the workflow is much different than it was 2 years ago or 5 years ago, and that's what you're trying to solve with your role. That's what you're trying to solve with some of the presentations we saw this morning. But there's a tremendous opportunity to bring those all together and almost change the order of how things happen. Shenan was reflecting fondly on TV commercials in the 50s. I know she never saw them. But they are, it's not as easy to create a nice, brilliant, creative, moving spot and then have it attached to media. You could literally live in a separate building and never talk to each other and be successful. To start planning from the get-go about the types of placements, the types of insights you've generated, the types of testing you might have done already on the creative in an online world that gave you real-time feedback about where to run your spot are so different that you have to reverse the order and bring everyone to that table immediately. And you literally have to imagine a world where there's data people in a room, a client in a room, creative people in a room, and media people in a room, and they have that conversation of what's the output that we wish to have, and how do we get all those parts together so we can actually plan in advance, we can optimize during the campaign, we can swap things for real-time events like this.
And what's the business problem?
Yeah.
I mean, let's start with what are we looking for the outcome to be, not just like what are we making, to your point.
Yep.
I do think that's one of the biggest changes that I'm seeing one of the biggest changes I'm seeing in the industry right now is we had Michael up here earlier talking about how media used to be the ass end of the meeting, right? And then I always joked, because I'm the digital person, that digital was the ass end of the ass end of the meeting. Right? So we ended up last, and then search, don't even go there. So unfortunate where search ended up at the end of that meeting. And so the fact that the media agency is now really the hub of all of that data about the consumer, about how the campaign performed, about the research leading into the campaign and the insights. We get all of this information up front. The conversation that says, oh, we're not going to brief the creative agency and then 6 months later talk to the media agency. We're going to put you guys in the same room because you can help each other in real and interesting ways, is really changing the conversation. I think it's ultimately going to end up changing what we see from creative. I do think we love our creative partners, but I do think sometimes the creatives themselves, not the data people on the creative side, but the creatives themselves struggle with the idea that somebody else is coming in with data that informs their idea. And they're used to having kind of carte blanche to say, I've got a vision, as opposed to, but I've got an insight that should help you drive that vision. And I think we're going to have to start to see a new breed of creatives. And we're starting to see a new breed of creatives that want to get that data and information.
To a certain extent, and probably if we were to measure the number of times that the word data is being said on this panel, let alone in this room, it's a little bit like, and again, I don't want to talk about my politics, but what the hell. It's like Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
You know, when you say data, it right away brings to mind a whole series of perspectives.
Yeah.
May be truthful, may not be truthful, but it comes with it. It bundles with a lot of stuff. Whether the creatives say, oh my God, it's data. If you came to them with insights, oh, that'd be helpful. So
maybe.
Can't change that. We are where we are.
The insights might be helpful. It depends on the creative. Some
Right.
of them don't want your insights either.
Right.
That's why I think you need a bit of that like translator. And
Exactly.
connector.
Right.
And it
Helps.
smooths it out, because I feel like that's mostly what I do. And I think we are at a tipping point right now. I think creatives want to understand. They want to tell us, like, what does the data say is what Lou Bars will start the conversation with. You know, I mean, and it is at the top of the process in the beginning and briefing together. So I agree.
Well, let me turn to the platforms, if you will, that are here to speak in terms of not only the creative part of it, but more in terms of, do you have some examples you could talk about in terms of things that you've seen that have worked from the data that you have and been working on within the company, as well, certainly also from the media's perspective?
So we, specifically in the marketing sciences group at Facebook, we're looking at data from both ends of the creative process. The first is, how can we leverage our vast user demographic conversation data to actually understand them and bring more of a non-branded insight to community? For instance, we just released a big survey, an analysis on how millennials are approaching financial planning. Not surprisingly, we find most of them are banking on mobile. So, clearly that, from a product perspective, banks should consider that. Something that at least struck me, considering how finance has been portrayed in the media for the last 10 years, is I think only 8% of the millennial surveyed said they trusted financial institutions. Right? 50% don't have anybody to give them advice, and most of them don't trust financial institutions. So that little bit of insight alone should hopefully spark some ideas amongst the creative people, the actual financial companies themselves, to say, oh, right, these are, millennials always had a bad rap, but they're starting to mature and grow up, I guess. And let's embrace them, but let's kind of be sensitive to the environment they've grown up in. And so data, our platform is able to uniquely leverage both access to the individual as well as demographics about them to understand those insights. And so, we release them, work with our financial services partners, and kind of just say, hey, here, this is what we know. Now let's hopefully work together and figure out a way to reach them and address these concerns.
So, go ahead.
That's good. There's a lot of ways to unpack that. There's so many dimensions that you can play with. A couple would be, we have a tremendous reservoir of information on what happened after an ad was shown that sit in our systems. We serve a lot of ads every day for a lot of advertisers, and within that data talk about types of creative that had better engagement metrics or better ROI metrics, and you can start to parse that out between what was in the ad that had the engagement metrics. So we've been starting to package differently what drives a good creative in a campaign for some of our customers when they've asked. And that leads to them to cut short the testing process, and they can start to really hone in on, what was the piece about the creative that drove the customer to engage? Was it, it could be as mundane as colors or offers, but what stories were working and what message were working? I think that's a really underdeveloped piece of information that we have, and we're trying to work with some of our partners now on how do we get that to them faster, more scalable in a way that works, so they can actually inform their creatives around and make some design choices after they have the big idea. And there's tremendous gains to be had there, and it's fairly untapped, but we've seen good success on it. I think another avenue is starting to really understand how storytelling evolves over time. So data on how things are working from an upper funnel perspective of driving awareness and engagement. You can start to layer in things like attribution pathing to things that really drive action. So as an agency and a customer are planning a creative messaging strategy, they can start to understand the appropriate time to use a message with a customer in the right mindset or in the right context. We can start to derive that types of intelligence that just help the journey flow work a lot better. It's not helping them build the creative, it's helping them use the creative better, which is sometimes just as important, if not more. And then, if you just think about Google broadly, we're doing a lot with the insights work to validate ideas, right? So, Shenan was talking about, can we give you an insight that helps you have the aha moment? The smartest creative directors that we've seen have come with a hypothesis. Like, they use their creative brain, they drive the insight that they think is going to really drive impact for their customer, and then they come test that insight to us. Like, we believe X. Can you tell us if that is true? And you can start to look through a lot of the search insight data or the Google Trends data, and you can start to say, well, yeah, we do see that, or no, we don't see it in that way, we're seeing these types of mechanics. And in many ways, that's a lot more valuable than us just giving them a bunch of insights. Yep. Right? Because we don't always know what insight they're looking for or where the mindset of the brand is at that moment in time and what they're trying to achieve. We just know what people are doing or what they're searching for. And when you can start to use that, go back and forth around, we believe X, can you help us validate? That's a really powerful thing, because that sort of short circuits the testing process and speeds it up, and it also maintains control in the creative process that they're getting their ideas to life.
Let me add a pivot to this conversation, right? Which is, there's a lot of insight and value to be had in platform-specific looks. But I also think, just as we can think of data in silos, we can think of media in silos, right? Like, all of these things interact with each other, and we can't even look at the digital ecosystem in and of itself, right? You have to think about how social interplays with television, interplays with something you hear somewhere, interplays with search, and how all of these pieces fit together. And to me, some of the most interesting developments now are in what we call digitizing broadcast data, right? So when you bring the depth and the intensity that you have in digital, but apply to the scale of broadcast. And there are lots of ways to do it. We can talk about it often, from machine learning to other fancy algorithms and so on. But I think when you start to really identify the consumer, not across just their digital fingerprint, and that ClickFuck example was a good example of that, but then when you take it even further than that and look at the same person in terms of what they hear and what they watch somewhere else, and make digital part of your larger story, and the consumer having digital touch points, but many other touch points as well, then I think you get to scale, and then I think you can think of creativity on a bigger canvas, for lack of a better term. And so I think we need to think beyond silos in even more transformative ways than we've been doing historically.
Well, just to follow up on that, because I would assume, within iHeart have that reality to deal with anyway, because you're dealing with, in a sense, your product, if you will, covers live, and you know better than I do, live and radio and whatever. So how do you really use data across those channels, if you will?
Exactly. So we get signals of identity from everywhere, right? We get it from the 80+ million registered users. We get all the other fingerprints they leave elsewhere. And then you also have the people calling in for contests and telephone databases, and so on. So you take these individual fingerprints that you have, for lack of a better term, but then you also have panel-based data sets, right? Whether it's Nielsen or somebody else, you have large panel-based data sets. And essentially, you need to connect or calibrate the two of them together. And again, methodologies are, there's a whole host out there, and we've made investments in at least a couple companies that we've announced that help us do this. Unified Media being one of them, Jelly being a programmatic arm. So again, if you take these different pieces and connect them not necessarily literally, but also through modeling, also through projections, and then think about the consumer. So if I think of, maybe not necessarily the 25-year-old woman with an individual identity, but 25-year-old women who live in New York, who listen to a certain type of music and shop in certain places, then you get to something interesting and can actually market to them with scale. And I think that's the fun of it.
So we have a little bit more time since the prior speaker went a little bit beyond it. So let's, a former history major, or I was a history major as well as a lawyer. So I think about history, but I also think about the future. So let's combine that in a question. So if you went back, pick the point, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and you tried to predict where we are today, not this moment sitting on a panel, but said, gee, was I right? That's one data point I would like to get your thoughts on. And then secondly, flip it. Here we are today. Let's predict forward 2 years, 3 years, pick a point. What do you see around the corner? What do you see peeking up behind the wizard's curtain? So let me just start, we'll go down.
Yeah, so 3 or 4 years ago, I was pretty wrong. That's kind of when mobile was first considered to, mobile was this new platform that people were talking about. And I always just thought of it from a consumer's perspective is the last thing I want is for people to start serving ads while I'm like texting or, on my phone.
Interesting.
So, and now I'm at Facebook, where one of the strongest mobile platforms out there. So clearly I was wrong and I went right into it.
So don't listen to anything he has to say next.
But I've learned from my mistakes,
There you
so now I can be right. I think the sentiment was brought up earlier, and it's about consumer awareness and ownership of data. And so one thing that I think about a lot lately is, wearable technology is starting to become increasingly popular. And I think part of when you wear technology, you literally are the data device, right? It's deeply personal. It's your heartbeat, it's your pulse, it's things like that. When you sleep, when you wake up. So I think wearables will make consumers hyper aware that their data is becoming a commodity. And with that, I'm not hoping or I'm just prognosticating that there will be a lot more consumer awareness around how their data is being used, and I think that will shape the data landscape. I don't know if it will create more silos or more regulation, but right now consumers, when polled, say they care, but they don't actively do anything about it oftentimes. But I don't think it's as personal yet as having your data, attached to your body yet. So.
Interesting.
So 3 or 4 years ago, we were all like, oh, this analytics thing is hot. This analytics thing is hot. I didn't think we quite realized how that simmer was going to go to a boil this rapidly, and that everyone was going to be talking about data all the time. And looking forward 3 or 4 years, right, I think this boiling pot of data, this boiling pot of advertising and creativity will be better. I'm going to be out there and say, will be better. There'll be better stories. There'll be better advertising. There'll be deeper, better ways of connecting with the consumers if we all take our jobs, if we take a long view on our jobs, right? And we think about our long-term consumer relationship and truly the consumer journey, because I think we are at a really chaotic point now, and I can't imagine that it's just going to be more chaos. I have to imagine that it's going to be better, but I also worry deeply about talent. And that's something that weighs on me all the time, because most of us are in the market for talent all the time, and I don't see the right talent coming out, right? I don't expect to hire people out of school and have them be perfect and be able to do the job, but if I look K through 12 as well as college and beyond, I don't think we're educating people correctly, right? I feel we have a huge issue in STEM. I feel we have a huge issue in STEAM, and I meet young people all the time, super bright, can honestly write pretty well, but have no number sense, right? They just don't have that intuitive sense around numbers that you need. I mean, most of us can look at a piece of data and we may not have done any analysis, but we know if it's right or if it's wrong. And a lot of people simply don't have that number sense. So I feel that's something that we all need to start taking more ownership of, educating more, starting younger and younger, best we can, and Otherwise, we're really going to have a crisis of talent 3 or 4 years out.
That's a good point. So looking back, so I come from 20 years of data-driven and CRM, so who would have thought that it'd be so cool right now, I guess. So I think that's my aha. I think moving forward, I think we're going to see a new model for agencies and creative. I think you're going to start to see this connective tissue, like I said, with creative and media coming, sitting, being together. Because we all know we're supposed to be together. I think that interconnectivity tissue, we'll start seeing more of that marketing science have more of the glue. I know Bbdo partners with Intellect. They are key to our connectivity and really agnostic of what media agency we have to partner with. So hopefully that will come to fruition. And I think the other part is we have to think of data sets in a new way, not just of what's being reported in. I always say clients don't buy dashboards. They want us to see everything. So how are we looking at cultural data or newsroom data? And how is that feeding in of what we're doing? We're doing some interesting things as we're looking at creating experiences. So I think those are sort of futuristic from an agency perspective.
So if I look backwards, I'm going to go a little bit further back than you asked. In the early 90s, my mother was the first ever manager of customer-specific data for Bristol-Myers Squibb. And what that meant was having 5 terminals in her office, not laptops, true terminals. One of them dedicated peer-to-peer connection with Walmart, getting their scanner data. And you weren't allowed to take that data anywhere except in that machine. You couldn't print it, you couldn't use it for anything else. So if she wanted to analyze something that was coming from the scanners at Walmart, she had to sit at that machine. She's grateful that she didn't end up with cancer from all the machines that were in that office. But it was interesting because even then, we were looking at what people were putting in their shopping cart, what the user behaviors were, how they were choosing the products that they were buying. And that experience for her actually had a tremendous influence on me, being very curious about consumer journeys and consumer buying habits and what causes somebody to have that moment of I need that, and it's that product that I ultimately want to buy. And I think that drove me to ultimately start my own advertising, my own digital media agency, ultimately drove me into MEC, and part of the draw to MEC was the tremendous digital and analytics department that we have and the data that we sit on and the ability to be able to collect it and analyze it and create those insights. When I look future-facing to take it a little bit more from a media and digital advertising perspective, because it's a high horse that I like to get on, I do think we have to see an evolution of what advertising is, specifically in the digital space. And we're starting to see it already. We talk about banner blindness. We talk about consumers not wanting to see ads, and ad blockers are clearly becoming an issue. What does that mean to the media agencies? It means that they ultimately have to change what they're putting forward as advertising. So you're seeing sites getting redesigned. You're getting delayed load times of ad units. You're getting brands that are starting to have persistent ad units so that they can have their pixels in view. All of those things are starting to change. I think the one piece that we're missing, and we're getting very close to it, and a couple of folks are playing with it, is time. Because time in front of that ad unit is to me, the most important metric. And I think what we're going to see, and I've said it for years now, and I'll say it again, is we're going to see a shift, and we're really on the cusp of it today, where we stop buying on a cost per 1,000 impressions. Because what is an impression if it's a millisecond versus an impression if it's 5 minutes? And we're going to start buying on what I like to call the CP30, or cost per 30 seconds of view time, which will start to relate it to the other media that we buy, and it'll give us an opportunity to actually truly understand the value of an engagement with the consumer.
That's a good story. So I've spent the last 8 years fighting the data wars within Google about advertising and programmatic technology. So my only procrastination for the last 5 years was that data would become important for targeting. That was my mission and my job inside of Google, to promote that, to make products realize that benefit. Unfortunately, that's happened. It's happened quite nicely. It's brought about all the other problems that we've been discussing. But we were hoping we'd see a Wall Street-like precision and efficiency type change in how media was bought and sold digitally, and that's happened, but it needs to evolve. As I think forward, there are really key questions I think advertisers are still seeking that they're going to drive the answers to. Some of them are what Shenan is talking about. Others are, I really truly believe, when you have to get to a sales lift metric that permeates all your touch points to a consumer. And there's so much energy behind that, so much brain power on both the advertiser side, on the retailer side, on the agency side, on the data analytics firm. I believe that will be a huge fight for the next 5 years to get right. And I expect that we'll see a lot of advancements in how we understand sales impact and sales lift, how we understand actually bringing consumers through a messaging journey and what impact it has on the outcome of ROI. And I think during that journey, marketers and agencies will start to understand how they can use data to actually affect change in the moment, and how they can use data to understand and validate their strategies, and they'll be able to segment those really effectively.
So, good. Go.
Surprisingly hard to get marketers to measure the right thing, even when they agree it's the right thing.
Yeah. Well, it's all incentives based. Publishers don't like to change because they like money.
Yeah.
Media agencies don't like to change because they have good results and they don't want results to go backwards.
We like money too.
You like money. Vendors like money. We want to measure things that you want to measure. I think we all get driven by the end state of as business gets harder to be profitable and costs become more constrained. The journey to the right answer is more important than ever, and everyone's going to have to get behind that.
Agreed.
So, first of all, I want to thank the 4A's for putting this forum together. And the panelists, hopefully they've driven insight and creativity and action to you. They certainly have to me. So I want to thank the panelists.